Good afternoon, folks. It's about 4 p.m, Sunday the 20th of July 2025, and today I'm doing a book review. Radio Girl. And it's by, as you can see, a David Dufty. I hadn't heard that name before. I've heard Duffy before, but Dufty with a T in it. By Alan and Unwin, Australia, 2020. So I read that book, took some notes, and I'm going to tell you my review of it. I'm just going to read this off the computer. So I'll change that screen over. And I just have to scroll the page as I go. Radio Girl by David Dufty. Born in 1890 in Melbourne as Florence Violet Wallace. Later married, she became Mrs. McKenzie, but she was always known then as Mrs. Mac. The poor family moved to a small New South Wales mining town. I didn't make a note. I think it's called Austinmere. But it was later connected on the Wollongong line into actual Sydney. So it's somewhere between central Sydney and Wollongong. And back in 1890, that was... they moved there when she was 2. So back in 1892, it was, a long way out of Sydney. In a small New South Wales mining town. Learning from her handyman father, she was fascinated by electricity, and even as a child would rig up battery-operated lights and buzzers around the family home. Eventually, she would become Australia's first woman amateur radio licence holder, and Australia's first woman who formally qualified as an electrical engineer. With only the most basic one-room school for the whole rural town, a schoolmistress, Mrs. Sarah Carroll, saw in young Violet such an aptitude for mathematics that she helped her gain a full scholarship to Sydney Girls High School. I believe that had opened not that long earlier. After attending high school, she initially started at the Sydney Teachers College, and she qualified there in 1913 with a focus on mathematics, and she went and taught in a small rural school. But after just a few months of teaching, she returned to Sydney determined to follow her true calling. In the meantime, her older brother George had returned to Sydney after being in England for some years, qualifying and becoming an electrical engineer. As the University of Sydney would not enrol a woman in the field of electrical engineering, she enrolled under its arts faculty, and then simply selected maths, science, chemistry and geology subjects that she hoped might one day be credited towards a degree there. Ultimately, George's business dealings went downhill, and Violet bought into them as a partner, and then she could claim herself as an apprentice to his electrical business. That allowed her entry to study part-time at Technical College, from which she later gained a diploma in electrical engineering. So Sydney would never give her a degree, but she got a diploma in electrical engineering. Initially trading as Miss F.V. Wallace, before she was married, one assumes, she took over a small upstairs shopfront being an existing electrical business. The book's a little unclear, but refers to it selling electrical motors and solenoids, and one assumes lighting supplies. She was well placed as radio came onto the scene in the early 1920s. Her shop quickly pivoted, specialising in selling radio components and becoming a hub for local amateurs and the curious public. In 1920, a Sydney Sun newspaper article called her Mademoiselle Edison. Early amateur radio enthusiasts had originally started the Wireless Institute of Australia, WIA, it exists today, and its monthly newsletter, but it had by then been captured by corporate interests, as a Marconi company agent, Ernest Fisk, came from England tasked to enforce Marconi brand patents in Australia. And by a mixture of legal threats and government cooperation, they somewhat hijacked and locked up the radio scene. The resulting AWA, Amalgamated Wireless Australia, being a monopoly backed up by the brute force of the government of the day. So, having teamed up with a handful of other enthusiasts, on 5 August 1922, Mrs. Mack's electrical shop started selling their own independently published Wireless Weekly magazine from her shop. By 1923, with corruption and insider deals rivalling even modern day's infamous New South Wales state governments of shonky land deals, pork barrelling, coal mines and pokies-funded clubs, the full force of the Marconi patents and AWA corporate monopoly kicked in, as Australian Prime Minister Billy Hughes was also the director of the AWA and also the head minister of the radio service. Conflict of interest, much. After a public conference that was just predetermined window dressing, the sealed set scheme was announced by the federal government in 1923, prohibiting the sale of all radios Australia-wide with any kind of frequency dial or tuning mechanism. Every radio had to be permanently tuned to one single station. Building one's own radio receiver sets, even including very basic crystal sets, where one person at a time can only listen with headphones, would be illegal. Remember, folks, that when civil servants draft these rules and politicians vote to pass them into law, this is your tax dollars at work. Remember that next time they claim they haven't got enough money for fixing schools and hospitals and roads or anything else. However, the independently published Wireless Weekly magazine railed in editorials against those new laws, while giving detailed instructions for home radio construction, along with clear reminders to its readers, please do not break any laws. Mrs. Mack's wireless shop was doing a roaring trade selling the individual components needed. Planned for years, Marconi Corporation's own inside man, Mr. Fisk, was foaming at the mouth with anticipation as the first commercial radio broadcasting licence in Australia was about to be issued, essentially to him, with a studio based in the Farmers Department Store building in Sydney. But Mrs. Mack and her supporters, including a consortium of small businesses, were able to beat them to it, creating a group, Broadcasters Limited, and got on the air first, and they became the first licensed commercial radio station in Australia. I believe until that time people were mostly listening to overseas stations, for which you'd need a big aerial. The sealed set scheme, or scam, was abandoned in 1924 due to such poor sales as to be unviable. By then, Mrs. Mack's electrical shop took over larger premises downstairs, whilst retaining the original upstairs premises for manufacturing components. The Wireless Weekly had grown to be a national magazine of some prominence, and was sold on to a publisher, earning Mrs. Mack a small fortune, eventually evolving over the decades into Electronics Australia. And everyone involved in electronics in Australia or New Zealand knows of the magazine Electronics Australia. Roll on 10 or more years and into the 1930s, with the winds of future war brewing, Mrs. Mack, shunned by all government departments and branches of the military, thought that teaching numbers of women to operate as Morse code telegraphists would free up men, if called upon for military service were war to break out. So she set up her own Women's Emergency Signalling Corps, paying from her own funds to rent a large building, an old wool store in poor condition, refurbishing it at her own expense, and buying and installing the necessary equipment. She also designed both winter and summer uniforms, comprising a skirt and heavy blazer or dungaree bib overalls over top a short-sleeved shirt. The uniforms were just sufficiently different from genuine military ones to avoid legal issues, despite the government changing the rules suddenly to try to trip her up. As well as Morse code, her students, local Sydney women, mostly younger ones, and some still in their teens, were also taught signalling using the Aldous ship's lantern and semaphore flags, using nearby Sydney parks for practice on fine days. And Mrs. Mack included music as part of her teaching practices. Eventually, sometime into World War II, after World War II was well raging, Mrs. Mack got some traction. Her husband, being a mid-level officer, possibly enabled some connections with the right people. Indeed, she is credited as being personally responsible for persuading the Navy to set up the RANS, the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, later to be followed by the Air Force and Army equivalents. For several years, Mrs. Mack was paying the rent on the whole building as she trained many women from scratch, but also helped many existing military men and sailors upskill, including many of the Americans stationed in Sydney. The military never paid for anything, but sometimes lent equipment such as aircraft radios for aircrew to use in training on her premises. Mrs. Mack was always facing pushback. Her girls never got into the post office telegraph service as she did first envisioned, due to the vehement opposition of the Post Office Employees Union. Mail telegraph operators were considered an essential service and therefore immune from any military call-up. Their union was determined to keep it that way. In early 1941, with the war still restricted to Europe, possibly North Africa as well, she was contacted by Commander Jack Newman of the Navy, who asked Mrs. Mack to send 8 of her best girls down to Melbourne for special extra training. It was all secret squirrel stuff indeed, where he stated the women didn't need to be any good at sending Morse, but had to be especially good at receiving. Mrs. Mack accompanied the 8 down to Melbourne on the train, where the Navy officer had obtained lodgings for them, with some expenses paid from his own pocket. They learnt Japanese kana, a way of sending Japanese characters using a form of Morse alphabet. These young women became crucial in helping to intercept coded Japanese transmissions. Unfortunately, so many stories of code breakers during the war are still mostly secret, even nowadays. At least there is a public museum now in Bletchley Park in Britain. Ultimately, the war ended, and as numbers being trained in Morse crash-dived, Mrs. Mack gave up the lease on the converted wool store, but maintained her interest in radio and Morse code lifelong. Come 1982, Mrs. Mack, by then long widowed and was living in a nursing home, but she was still visited regularly by some of her girls, and she passed away peacefully in her sleep, aged 91. With utmost modesty right to the end, as Reverend J.R. Henderson of Greenwich's St Giles Anglican Church, Sydney, officiated, he said that under her specific instructions there was not to be any retelling or praise of her earthly good works at her funeral service. Some years later, as Australia's 1988 bicentennial was approaching, there were to be offered 200 special awards to worthy Australians. Pushed along by surviving ex-RANs and some of her original Women's Emergency Signalling Corps, a substantial dossier of research was collated as a submission. Although she failed to gain a place within those 200 bicentennial awards, that research was stored at the Naval Repository on Spectacle Island, Sydney, and later that was accessed by David Dufty in his research for this book. He also credits earlier research done by ABC National Radio journalist Catherine Frayne, for the Hindsight Radio documentary series. The end of the book has an index and a substantial list of acknowledgements, so good for anyone wanting to do research there, plus a range of quality black and white photos in the middle. Just as best quality as one can get in the book. There's quite a few there, black and white ones. So Radio Girl by David Dufty, published by Alan and Unwin in 1920 in Australia. It's got an ISBN, so you'll be able to find that out on Google. I recommend this book highly. It is available through the Christchurch Combined Library System. It may be available through libraries in other regions. It may be available through the library in your region. It may be possible to rent the book through e-reader platforms such as Kindle or others. Remember that e-books can be re-edited, redacted or removed entirely from your collection at any time if the provider so wishes. They shouldn't be allowed to use terms like buy now when you're only renting. So perhaps it's better to order it in and buy an actual real book of your own to keep. And I will just take a moment, I'll just get that screen up. And I'll give you a quick look at these photos here, which some pictures of her in the early 1900s, I think. Oh, she also included, in their magazine, she included recipes and poems. One of those photos is the one that you'll see on Wikipedia, I think. A lot of them are credited to the RANZ or ex-RANZ Association. Not necessarily episode 1, but there's the Wireless Weekly magazine. Picture of the shop front, I think, there on that one. And yeah, she also ran like a women's electrical institute of some kind. Paying for these things herself. A few more photos. Photos of them all lined up. So eventually she was, you know, they did have the women's officially part of the military. There was another photo here I was looking for. Anyway, there's lots of black and white photos here. And I can't find the one that I wanted. There it is. Showing them in their whether you call them bib style overalls or dungarees. Right. Well, that's all, folks. I'm glad I read this book. Probably wouldn't want to pay $40 or $50 or $60 just to read it for myself once, but very happy to get it out from the library and read it. And if you can find or afford one yourself, you know, I recommend it. If you're interested in amateur radio, Morse code telegraphy, the early days of radio and that kind of thing, or the connection with the military, the women's military, the various auxiliary or women's units in the Army, Navy or Air Force that provided support during World War II. So that's all. The camera's still doing its little face framing thing. It's never done it before. It's obviously turned something on in the menu that's, I don't know. Yeah, that's a Morse code chart on the wall. That's not the way I am trying to learn it. I'm using the Farnsworth and Koch methods, which is supposedly together. The way to do it now, supposedly better. That's good if you just got to look a letter up. A single letter or something. Alright folks, that's all. We'll get this book review up. I recommend it. I'll be taking the book back to the library probably tomorrow. So, alright folks. Okay, Bye. I've got to get up to go and turn the camera off. Alright, I'll sit for another minute. Alright, you've had long enough. I've got to turn the camera off. Cheerio, folks.